Welcome to my channel. The dark slave. The survival of Mororo Reach, they claimed, was due to white men mastering the sea. This was the lie. In truth, the plantation endured because one enslaved woman understood every gate, every canal, and every inch of the ground beneath it. In 1822, when slave catchers began vanishing along the Direra coast, the blame was placed on the tide. No one questioned the woman who held the keys. Mororo Reach was never meant to exist. Situated on reclaimed coastal land in Direra, British Ghana, the plantation lay lower than the sea. Sugarcane grew there only because packed earth walls held back the Atlantic, and a network of canals drained the fields. The owners called it engineering, rarely admitting who had built it. Enslaved laborers dug those canals with their hands, raising the embankments basket by basket. They stood waist-deep in mud while supervisors watched from dry land. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others fell ill from the stagnant water. When a section failed, the workers were blamed. When it held, the plantation owner took the credit. By 1822, Mororo Reach was among the most profitable estates on that coast, its survival dependent on wooden sluice gates, and so was everyone living there. Abini Vale knew this better than anyone. At 41, she had spent nearly 2 decades working the drainage system. Her official duties appeared simple: clear weeds from smaller channels, remove debris from gate hinges, inspect water levels, report damage to overseers. The work seemed low in status, but it was not low in consequence. A gate opened too early could drown a cane field, one closed too late could weaken an entire road. A blocked channel could turn hard ground to deep mud before sunrise. Abini learned the system because mistakes were punished. She learned it more deeply because knowledge was her only protection. She could sense the tide changing without seeing the sea, listening to the pressure against the barriers. She watched insects move away from rising water and smelled salt before it entered the outer channels. She knew which embankments had been poorly repaired, which roads were solid only on the surface, and where the plantation was weakest. The men who controlled Mororo Reach believed she knew only obedience. That error would later cost them dearly. Years of working near rushing water gave Abini a useful disguise. She let the overseers think her hearing was damaged. When they spoke, she sometimes leaned forward and asked them to repeat themselves. When they gave instructions, she paused before responding. The performance was convincing because it confirmed what they already wanted to believe. To them, Abini was just an aging enslaved woman assigned to muddy work, useful but not intelligent, present but not important. Close enough to hear private conversations, yet too limited to understand them. They spoke freely around her: punishments, escape attempts, patrol routes, reward payments, and captures along the coastal rivers. Abini listened, remembered, and never reacted. The owner, Cornelius Rusk, 58, presented himself as disciplined rather than cruel, avoiding public anger in favor of ledgers, schedules, and controlled consequences. Yet he profited from sugar and more. He supplied horses, boats, dogs, and provisions to slave-catching parties across the coastal plantations. When an enslaved person escaped, owners paid for pursuit. When captured, hunters received a reward. Cornelius took a share for his equipment and access. Human terror was just another line in his accounts. The most effective hunter was Thaddeus Krall, 49, heavily built, and known for his detailed records of every pursuit. He marked where people were captured, how far they traveled, and which routes they tried. He treated escape as a technical problem, studying habits, family connections, work assignments, and river traffic. He paid informants, questioned people separately, and compared their answers. He understood that fear worked best when it appeared organized. Thaddeus often claimed no one crossed his section of the Demerara coast without being found. For years, that was nearly true. Abini had personal reason to know. 3 years earlier, she and her husband Mako Sa had attempted escape from Mororo Reach. Mako, 45, was a skilled canal worker who had helped repair embankments on neighboring estates. Like Abini, he understood the water. They planned their route for months, avoiding main roads, choosing a night when the tide would hide their footprints near the outer marsh, and arranging to meet a boatman beyond an abandoned rice canal. The plan failed before they reached the river. Someone had informed the hunters. Abini remembered the lanterns appearing behind them, the dogs entering the reeds, and Mako pushing her toward a narrow drainage ditch while he turned back to slow the pursuit. Both were captured before dawn. Abini was returned to Mororo Reach in restraints, Mako was taken elsewhere. Cornelius refused to tell her where. Days later, he called her to the yard outside the estate house. He informed her that Mako had died while resisting his captors. No body, no grave, no witnesses. Cornelius gave her only a warning: you remain useful as long as you remain obedient. Abini did not answer, silence was safer. But the explanation never satisfied her. Weeks later, a new tracker began riding with Thad Discrawl. He was a black man, tall and broad-shouldered, kept separate from the other enslaved workers, with a dark leather covering most of his face. The hunters called him the Black Jackal, a name meant to reduce him to an instrument. What mattered was his knowledge. He recognized hidden paths, found markers carved into trees, noticed broken reeds and disturbed mud that others missed. Under his guidance, several escape attempts failed. Abini saw him only from a distance at first. Then one afternoon, he rode through Mororo Reach. She was standing beside a drainage channel when the patrol passed. The masked tracker turned his head slightly, and the movement stopped her. The angle of his shoulders was familiar, as was the way he held the reins low in his left hand. Mako had ridden that way when moving supply animals. Abini watched until the patrol disappeared beyond the cane, telling herself that resemblance was not proof. But the Black Jackal appeared again and again, and each time her certainty grew: Mako had not died. He had survived. And worse, he had joined the men who hunted people like them. Abini began to believe that he had traded information for his own life, revealing escape paths, that the man who once planned freedom beside her now rode at the front of the pursuit. The plantation had taken her husband twice, first physically, then morally. She carried that judgment in silence. During the day, she continued clearing mud from the gates, repairing hinges, lowering her eyes when Thaddeus entered the workyard. At night, she listened to patrols leaving the estate. She did not know that her understanding of Mako was wrong, that the mask concealed a different kind of imprisonment. She knew only what the system allowed her to see, and that was how slavery preserved control, by separating people, restricting information, and forcing them to build conclusions from arranged lies. Cornelius didn't need Abini to witness Mako's death, he needed her to believe in his betrayal. One evening, several hunters returned after searching the Eastern Canal District, their boots covered in black mud. Abini was ordered to clean them near the stable. The men drank while she worked, discussing a new operation. A group of enslaved adults was believed to be gathering near an abandoned rice canal north of the estate. Thaddeus planned to surround the area before dawn, with the Black Jackal leading the first riders through the reeds. One man laughed: "They think the canal hides them." Another answered, "Not from him." Abini kept scrubbing. They named the route, the hour, the position of the dogs, and the number of armed riders, all within reach of her hands, not one of them lowering his voice. Abini lifted one boot and examined the mud packed into its sole. It came from a narrow western track that remained firm only when the inner channel was open. She knew the road, the tide, and that the wooden marker at the bend directed riders away from the weakest ground. For years, she had maintained that marker because she was ordered to protect plantation traffic. Now she understood something the hunters did not: the road was not safe because it was strong, it was safe only because she had allowed it to remain strong. That night, after the yard lamps went dark, Abini walked toward the western canal, carrying no weapon but a small wooden mallet used for gate repairs. At the bend, she found the route marker, loosened it, and moved it less than 2 feet to the left, almost impossible to notice. By morning, it would point mounted men toward ground already weakening beneath the surface. Abini pressed the post back into the mud, erased the marks around it with her bare foot, and looked toward the seawall. The tide was beginning to rise. The altered marker did not stop the raid, it delayed one patrol by less than 20 minutes. That was enough to separate 3 riders from Thad Discrawl's main force, but not enough to protect the people gathered near the abandoned rice canal. The hunters had planned for confusion, approaching from 3 directions, 2 groups through the cane fields, a third by boat along the drainage channel. The Black Jackal led the men entering through the reeds. Before midnight, Yara Ven, 37, knew something was wrong. She had spent years moving information between plantations without attracting attention, carrying messages while delivering tools, memorizing patrol schedules while working beside estate roads. She never wrote names or routes down, paper could be found, memory had to be broken. That night, she had gathered 11 adults near the remains of an old pumping station, its roof long gone, concealed by cane grass and a collapsed water channel offering access to the northern marsh. The group was meant to leave in pairs, with a boatman meeting them farther west. Yara had chosen the location because no plantation patrol had inspected it in months. Then she found the warning, one wooden drainage marker near the canal had been turned toward the west. It was not part of the planned signal system, someone had moved it recently, the mud around the base smooth but not natural. Yara crouched and touched it. "Someone knows," she said. No one asked who. There was no time. She ordered the group into the drainage trench and began moving them away from the pumping station. The first dog barked before they reached the reeds, lanterns appearing behind them. Thad Dis had expected them to run south and had already placed riders there. The western path was closing, the main canal blocked by a boat carrying armed men. The route had not merely been discovered, it had been studied. Yara divided the group, 6 moved toward the mangroves, 4 followed her into a narrow drainage cut. The last person, Sela Dune, 39, remained beside a man who had fallen against the broken wall. Sela worked in the Mororo Reach cookhouse and had known Abini for more than a decade. She was not part of Yara's regular network, she had joined the escape because the plantation announced that several adults would be transferred inland after the harvest, and Sela understood what transfer meant: distance, isolation, the destruction of every connection that might make resistance possible. The man beside her had injured his leg climbing into the trench. He tried to stand, but the joint would not support him. "Go," he told her. Sela put his arm across her shoulders and they moved less than 30 yards before the hunters entered the clearing. The Black Jackal reached them first, pulling his horse across the path and looking toward the reeds where Yara's group had disappeared. For seconds, he did nothing, a hesitation that mattered. Thad Dis arrived behind him. "Which way?" The masked tracker pointed toward the southern cane road. Yara had gone west. It was the first deliberate act of protection that Abini would later fail to recognize. Thad Dis sent 4 riders south, buying Yara several minutes, but Sela and the injured man remained exposed. A dog moved toward them. Sela tried to pull her companion into the water channel, but the mud reached above their knees. The hunters surrounded them before they crossed. From behind a raised bank, Abini watched. She had followed the patrol after leaving the marker, not knowing whether her warning had reached anyone, only that the hunters were moving toward the rice canal and that Sela had mentioned extra food disappearing from the cookhouse. Abini arrived too late to change the outcome. She saw Sela standing in the channel with one arm around the injured man, Thad Dis dismounting and ordering Sela to release him. She refused. There was no speech, no plea, no dramatic declaration, only a short command: "Move away." Sela remained. The confrontation ended quickly. A rider struck her with the stock of his weapon, she fell against the channel's edge, and when she attempted to rise, another man forced her back down. The violence was controlled, practiced, and unnecessary, the hunters had already won. Sela was surrounded, the injured man could not run. What followed was not required to make an arrest, it was punishment for resistance. By the time they pulled the man from the mud, Sela was no longer moving. Abini remained behind the bank. If she stepped forward, she would be taken; if she called out, she would expose her knowledge of the escape route. The system had placed her in the position it repeatedly created for enslaved people: witness the crime, survive it, and carry the guilt of not stopping men who held every weapon and legal protection. The black jackal turned toward the bank. Abini lowered herself into the reeds. For a moment, she believed he had seen her, but he did not alert the others. Instead, he moved his horse between her position and Thaddeus, then looked back toward Sela. The lantern light reached the side of his mask. Beneath it, Abini saw the line of his jaw. She recognized him. Not through hope, through anger. Mako had a small scar near his left ear from a gate chain that snapped years earlier. Abini could not see the scar clearly, but she saw the raised line where it disappeared beneath the leather. The masked man was her husband. He had ridden at the front of the men who killed Sela. He had stood over 2 captured people and done nothing. Abini did not see that he had misdirected the main pursuit, that 6 adults were already moving safely toward the mangroves because of his false instruction. She saw only what the plantation allowed her to see: Mako beside Thaddeus, wearing the mask of a tracker. That image settled the matter. The hunters tied the injured man's hands and placed him across a horse. Sela's body was left beside the channel until morning. The patrol departed before dawn, the black jackal riding last. As he passed the raised bank, he slowed, his left hand opening against his leg with 2 fingers extended, a signal he and Abini had once used while working on opposite sides of a canal: danger behind you. Abini watched without moving, believing the gesture was a warning to remain silent. In reality, it was the only message he could risk giving her. Yara reached the western marsh with 6 people, the others were captured before sunrise. At Mororo Reach, Cornelius ordered the returned prisoners placed under guard, questioning them separately, demanding names: who had warned them, who had arranged the boat. No one named Abini. Yara remained hidden for 2 days before sending word that she had survived. Sela received no burial ceremony. Her body was placed in a shallow grave beyond the cane fields, away from the estate cemetery. Cornelius refused to stop work for the burial. The next morning, Abini was ordered back to the drainage gates, cleaning mud from the main release mechanism, checking timber braces, removing reeds caught beneath the lower door. Her hands remained steady. That afternoon, she inspected the western road where the separated patrol had traveled after following the altered marker. The surface had cracked, salt water had entered beneath it through an old side channel. The ground looked firm but was not. Abini drove a narrow testing pole into the road. It sank almost to the handle. 3 riders had crossed hours earlier and survived only because the tide had not yet reached its highest point. The next group would not be as fortunate. Abini looked toward the abandoned rice canal. Sela was dead, several adults captured, Mako alive and, as far as Abini understood, working for the men responsible. Grief no longer required interpretation, it required structure. That night, Abini entered the sluice house and closed the door, studying the gate controls one by one: the western channel, the inner drainage trench, the old cane road, the route used by mounted patrols returning from the river. For years, she had operated the system to protect the plantation. Now she began calculating how to turn it against those who enforced it. Abini did not act immediately. Impulse would have exposed her. The drainage system was inspected every morning, and any obvious alteration would lead to the workers assigned. She needed the first failure to resemble neglect, weather, or ordinary decay. For 3 days, she did nothing except observe, recording no information, carrying no map, counting patrols by memory and matching them to the tides. Thaddeus Kral's riders used the western cane road when returning from searches near the river, preferring it because it was shorter and wide enough for horses to travel in pairs. At one bend, the road crossed an abandoned side channel that had been filled with mud and cane waste years earlier. The surface appeared stable. Below it, the old channel still carried water. Abini had tested the ground after Sela's death. She knew that a small increase in pressure from the inner canal would soften the foundation without leaving visible flooding. The change required less than a minute. Near sunset, she entered the western sluice house under the pretense of clearing a blocked hinge. No guard followed her. The task was considered dirty, repetitive, and beneath supervision. She lifted the secondary release lever by one notch, water entering the buried channel, then she lowered the lever and removed the wet marks from the wood with a cloth. Nothing outside appeared different. That night, 3 slave catchers returned from a failed search south of Mororo Reach, angry about wasted time. They approached the western bend at speed. The first horse crossed the weakened ground, its front legs breaking through the road, throwing its rider forward. The second struck the first and turned sideways, the third attempted to stop, lost its footing, and slid toward the collapsed channel edge. The road opened beneath them. The failure was sudden, but not mysterious. Years of poor construction, rushed repairs, and careless maintenance had created the conditions. Abini had only chosen the moment. By the time workers arrived with ropes and lanterns, the mud had taken the 3 riders below the surface. 2 horses escaped, one remained trapped until morning, pulled free with a team of oxen. Cornelius Rusk inspected the damage after sunrise, blaming the workers. That response was predictable. Plantation management depended on blaming the enslaved for failures created by the plantation itself. The road had been built cheaply, repaired badly, and forced to carry more traffic than it could support, yet Cornelius treated the collapse as proof of worker incompetence, ordering 6 men to rebuild the embankment before nightfall. Abini stood nearby while Thaddeus examined the broken ground, pushing a pole into the mud and watching it disappear. The collapse troubled him because the road had been crossed safely only hours earlier. He questioned the gate workers. Abini allowed him to repeat himself twice before answering. She said the western sluice had remained closed. Technically, it had. He asked whether she had seen anyone near the channel. She shook her head. That was also true. Thaddeus studied her face, then dismissed her. The investigation ended where prejudice required it to end. He did not believe a woman like Abini could manipulate tidal pressure with precision, understand patrol routes, or stand in front of him and give answers designed to survive scrutiny. His contempt protected her more effectively than any disguise. The deaths were recorded as an accident. Cornelius paid the families of the hunters nothing, claiming the road collapse had resulted from their decision to ride too quickly. Even among men who enforced slavery, loyalty ended where financial responsibility began. Abini waited 4 more nights. The western road remained closed for repairs, so patrol shifted to the northern embankment, a raised path beside a large drainage canal. That route had a different weakness. A wooden retaining wall supported one section where soil had washed away during the previous rainy season. The wall appeared solid from above, but several lower braces had rotted. Abini did not remove them. She loosened the soil around 2 support pegs and redirected a narrow stream of runoff toward the base. The damage developed slowly, no single action identifiable as sabotage. On the second night after the adjustment, 5 riders crossed the embankment while returning from patrol, moving in a tight line because the road was narrow. The retaining wall shifted, the first 2 horses reached firm ground, but the third caused the weakened section to break outward, and the remaining riders fell with the road. The canal was not deep enough to conceal what had happened, but the collapse trapped men and horses beneath mud, timber, and broken earth. Workers heard the noise from the nearest cane field. By the time they arrived, 2 riders had escaped, 3 were missing, and 5 horses were recovered without riders. The survivors gave conflicting accounts. One insisted the road had moved beneath him, another claimed he heard wood breaking before the collapse. Neither explanation satisfied Thaddeus. He returned at dawn with the black jackal. Abini watched from the opposite side of the canal. The masked tracker dismounted and inspected the retaining wall, finding the redirected runoff almost immediately. He followed the wet soil back toward a smaller drainage cut, then stopped. The evidence was clear enough for a trained observer. Water had been guided toward the damaged supports. The channel had not formed naturally. Mako looked across the canal. Abini remained partly concealed behind a gate frame. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Mako used his boot to collapse the narrow cut, pushing loose mud over the waterline and erasing the path back toward the smaller sluice. Thaddeus approached him. Mako pointed instead to a section of rotten timber. The inspection ended there. Abini saw the entire exchange and misunderstood it. She believed Mako was hiding his own negligence, assuming he had failed to notice the damaged wall before leading the riders across it and now feared punishment from Thaddeus. She did not yet understand that he had recognized her method, nor that he had chosen to protect it. The second collapse changed the atmosphere at Mororo Reach. 3 disappearances could be dismissed as misfortune, 8 missing riders within days required explanation. Cornelius summoned neighboring plantation owners to the estate house. The meeting was closed, but Abini carried water into the room and heard enough. Some blamed the drainage workers, others unusual tides, one accused independent slave catchers of exaggerating the deaths to demand higher fees. Thaddeus rejected all of them, believing the failures were connected but unable to prove how. The hunters continued operating, but their confidence had weakened. Riders slowed before crossing bridges, dismounted near soft ground, and some refused to use the western and northern roads at night. That hesitation produced the first measurable result. 2 nights after the retaining wall collapsed, Yara moved 4 adults through a neglected cane path east of the plantation. The nearest patrol arrived almost half an hour late because the riders stopped repeatedly to inspect the road, and the 4 reached a waiting canoe. For the first time since Sela's death, an escape from the Mororo Reach district succeeded. Abini learned of it the following morning when she found a strip of woven fiber tied beneath a gate hinge, Yara's signal. 4 had crossed. No names were included, none were needed. Abini held the fiber for several seconds, then pushed it deep into the mud where no overseer would find it. The disappearances had not restored what had been taken from her. Sela remained dead, the captured adults under guard, Mako still riding with the hunters, but the balance had shifted. A road collapse had slowed the pursuit, fear had entered the patrols, and 4 people had used the delay to move beyond Cornelius Rusk's control. That consequence changed Abini's objective. She was no longer acting only against the men responsible for Sela's death. She was beginning to understand that the drainage system could do more than punish hunters, it could create time. Time to leave the fields, time to reach the mangroves, time to put water between a human being and the person claiming ownership over that life. Abini returned to the sluice house after dark and examined the gate sequence controlling the old cane transport road. The route was wider than the previous crossings and used by larger patrols. Weakening it would require several nights and produce a failure too large to dismiss easily. Abini placed both hands on the release mechanism and began the next calculation. The old cane transport road did not fail at once. Abini weakened it over 4 nights, releasing water into the buried channels in short intervals, never long enough to leave standing pools, and reopening clogged cuts beneath the embankment, then covering the disturbed soil before daylight. Each tide removed a little more earth from below. From above, the road remained wide, dry, and reliable. That appearance was necessary. Abini no longer wanted one rider to enter the weakened section, she wanted an entire patrol to trust it. The deaths along the western road and northern canal had changed how the hunters moved. Men who once crossed the plantations in pairs now traveled in groups of 6 or 8, carrying long poles to test the ground, some forcing enslaved laborers to walk ahead of the horses. The precaution was presented as discipline, it was fear. The same men who had entered cabins without warning and pursued people through darkness now refused to place a boot on unfamiliar mud. They demanded additional payment for night patrols, argued over who should ride first. Every delay created an opening. Yara used those openings. She stopped organizing large departures, instead moving adults in groups of 2 or 3 through routes the hunters considered too slow or too wet. A cook left while carrying refuse beyond an estate boundary, 2 field workers entered a drainage trench during a patrol change and did not return, a carpenter crossed the river beneath sacks in a supply boat. There were no public celebrations, success had to remain invisible. At Mororo Reach, missing workers were listed as fugitives. Cornelius increased searches and reduced food allocations for those he suspected of knowing more than they admitted. Collective punishment was not a failure of the system, it was one of its standard instruments. Cornelius understood that hunger could force information from people who had survived threats. He ordered work crews questioned after dark, separated partners and close friends, and promised reduced punishment to anyone who identified Yara's contacts. No one gave him Abini's name, most did not know it belonged in the answer that protected her. On the 6th night of the campaign, Thaddeus sent 8 riders down the old cane transport road. 2 men walked ahead with testing poles. The surface appeared firm, their poles reaching compact earth because the damage was deeper and farther toward the canal wall. Abini watched from a maintenance platform, waiting until the final horse entered the center section. Then she opened a narrow gate feeding the buried channel. The road did not collapse beneath the first riders, it sank behind them. The last section dropped several feet, dividing the patrol. Horses turned in the confined space, the front riders attempted to push forward, but the remaining embankment began breaking along the canal edge. The patrol lost formation, lanterns fell, and men who had entered as an organized unit left in separate directions, abandoning equipment and one another. 3 did not return. The survivors reached Mororo Reach after sunrise, covered in mud and unable to agree on what had happened. One claimed the canal wall had split, another insisted the road had been hollow beneath them, a third said water had appeared from nowhere. Thaddeus listened without interruption, then ordered all of them back to the site. 2 refused. He struck one across the mouth and dismissed the other from future patrols. Violence could enforce obedience, it could not restore confidence. By the 7th night, the official number of dead or missing hunters had reached 17. The actual number was higher because several injured men died on neighboring estates and were not included in Cornelius's count. The plantation owners began meeting without Cornelius, questioning whether Mororo Reach remained a useful base for pursuit. Some accused him of failing to maintain his roads, others suspected his enslaved workers were cooperating with escape groups. Cornelius responded by increasing supervision around the sluice houses. For the first time, Abini could no longer enter every gate station alone. She adjusted, instead of changing the gates directly, she began altering the information hunters relied upon. She turned warning lanterns toward safe ground that would soon become flooded, placed fresh wool marks on abandoned routes, left broken reeds leading away from actual escape paths. The method changed, but the purpose remained the same: make pursuit expensive, make certainty impossible. One night, Yara moved 9 adults through a mangrove channel east of the estate. Thaddeus received the report before they reached the boats, assembled 12 riders, and ordered the black jackal to follow the tracks. Mako examined the reeds. The escape group had moved east, he pointed west. Thaddeus sent 8 riders after him. Mako led them through shallow water across an abandoned cultivation plot and toward a raised road nearly 4 miles from Yara's route, stopping twice to examine false prints he created with the edge of his boot. The delay lasted more than an hour. By the time Thaddeus recognized the deception, Yara's group had reached the river. Abini saw only part of the operation. From beside an eastern sluice, she watched Mako guide the patrol away from the mangroves, believing he had lost the trail. Later that night, she found a carved symbol beneath the gate lever, 2 short lines crossed by a third, a sign she and Mako had used years earlier: "The road behind you was watched." The carving was fresh. Abini touched it once, then scraped it away. She did not interpret it as protection, she believed Mako was warning her because he suspected she had been near the gates. In her mind, the message carried a threat: stop before the hunters identify you. The misunderstanding hardened her resolve. If Mako knew someone was using the drainage system and still remained beside Thaddeus, then Abini assumed he would eventually expose the sabotage. She could no longer proceed slowly, the next operation had to damage the hunting network before Mako could stop her. On the 8th night, Abini prepared 3 connected sluices controlling the northern canal, the cane transport trench, and a low crossing used by patrols returning from the coast. Opening all 3 together was forbidden, the sudden pressure could break sections of the embankment and flood valuable fields. The plantation rules protected sugar, they did not protect the people forced to produce it. Abini loosened the safety locks before the patrol departed, placing the removed pins inside a hollow gate post and returning to work before dawn. That evening, Thad disorganized 14 riders to sweep the eastern marsh and restore authority through force. The Black Jackal rode with them. Abini waited inside the central sluice house, hearing the patrol before she saw it, hooves striking the transport road in a controlled rhythm, lanterns moving between the fields. The riders entered the low crossing. Abini opened the first gate, water entering the cane trench. She opened the second, the northern canal rising against the retaining wall. When the last riders reached the center of the crossing, she released the third gate. The pressure broke through beneath the road. Water moved across the patrol's front and rear, cutting it into isolated groups. Horses turned away from the current, riders attempted to reach higher ground, but the nearest embankment had already begun to split. Mako left the road first, driving his horse into a shallow drainage cut and disappearing behind the cane. Abini saw him escape, taking it as further proof that he had known what was coming. The others were not as prepared. By morning, 7 more hunters were dead or missing. The total reached 24. Cornelius closed the northern roads. Thad prohibited night travel until the drainage system could be inspected. For 2 nights, no mounted patrol left Mororo Reach. During that silence, Yara moved 19 adults toward the coast. The hunters' absence had become more valuable than their deaths. Abini understood the distinction. Her objective was no longer the destruction of individual men, it was the collapse of the system that allowed them to operate. But Cornelius could not permit that collapse. He brought in additional hunters from estates farther inland, men who had not witnessed the road failures, who mocked the survivors and dismissed the warnings as cowardice. On the 9th night, 7 of them entered the marsh through routes Abini had already prepared. None returned. 31 slave catchers were now dead or missing. The coastal roads fell quiet. For several days, the route toward the river stood almost open. Then Thad entered the central sluice house while Abini was working alone, closing the door behind him. He placed one hand on the main release lever and looked directly at her. Someone, he said, had taught the water where to strike. Abini lowered her eyes. Thad did not dismiss her. This time, he waited for an answer. He remained between her and the door. The central sluice house was narrow, 2 control levers occupied the far wall, a maintenance table stood beneath a shuttered window, no second exit. Abini kept one hand inside the gate housing as if she were still clearing debris. Thad looked at the wet floor, the release mechanisms, and the iron pins that secured them. Someone understands this system. Abini leaned forward slightly. What did you say? He did not repeat himself. The pretense that had protected her for years was no longer sufficient, but abandoning it would confirm his suspicion. She waited, allowing silence to work against him. Thad stepped closer, examining her hands. The skin around her fingers was split from mud, rope, and salt water. Nothing about them proved sabotage. Every drainage worker carried the same damage. He asked who had access to the gatehouses after dark. Abini named the workers assigned to each shift, all adults. Most moved between the canals so frequently that responsibility could not be fixed to one person. Thad asked whether any mechanism had failed. Abini pointed to a warped timber brace and explained that pressure had increased since the northern embankment broke. Her answer was technical enough to be useful, ordinary enough to sound learned through repetition. He listened closely. The danger was not that Abini would say too little, it was that she might reveal how much she knew. Thad placed his hand on the main lever and pulled. It resisted because the safety lock was engaged. Could one person open all 3 gates? Abini looked toward the mechanism, then shook her head. It was a calculated lie. One person could open them, she had already done it. But the sequence required timing, leverage, and knowledge of where the wood would catch under pressure. Thad stared at her for several seconds. Then someone struck the outside door. A guard reported that Cornelius Rusk wanted him at the estate house. Thad left without warning Abini and without apologizing for the interrogation. Men like him considered intrusion a right. Abini waited until his footsteps disappeared, then removed her hand from the gate housing. She had been holding one of the missing safety pins. If Thaddeus had ordered her to open her fist, the campaign might have ended there. She returned the pin to its slot and finished the inspection. The confrontation changed her position. Thaddeus did not have proof, but he had begun looking in the correct direction. The sluice houses would be watched, the roads inspected before every patrol. Any further operation against small groups of hunters would increase the chance of discovery. Abini needed a different objective. 2 nights later, Yara found her near an abandoned drainage well beyond the western cane fields. She did not speak until they were below the embankment and hidden from the nearest watch post. Yara had not come to ask about the dead hunters, she had come with a number, 63. That was how many adults were prepared to leave the surrounding estates: cane cutters, carpenters, cooks, launderers, blacksmiths, boat workers, field laborers. Some came from Mororo Reach, others had crossed secretly from neighboring plantations. No children were included, the decision was deliberate. The route required hours in deep mud, a narrow crossing under pursuit, and immediate boarding onto a concealed vessel. Yara would not disguise the danger. Abini listened without interrupting. A coastal trader willing to carry them beyond plantation control would wait outside the mangrove channel for one night, but the vessel could not approach the inner canals without grounding. The group had to reach it by crossing an old embankment known as the King's Spine. The road was less than 6 feet wide in places, salt marsh on one side, tidal basin on the other. Mounted hunters could move across it quickly, a large group on foot could not. Yara wanted Abini to close the drainage channels before the crossing and hold the ground firm until everyone reached the far side. Abini rejected the plan. Closing the channels would leave tracks across the embankment and give Thaddeus a clear line of pursuit. Even if the 63 reached the mangroves, the hunters could follow them directly to the boats. The King's Spine could not merely remain open, it had to disappear behind them. Abini explained the alternative: the group would cross during the final hour before the tide turned. Once the last person reached the far bank, she would release water from the main basin and open the outer sluice. The flood would strike the road from both sides, erasing tracks, breaking sections of the embankment, and preventing horses from crossing. Yara understood the consequence immediately: someone had to remain at the gatehouse. The outer sluice was old, its main lever had to be held through the first release because the locking teeth no longer aligned properly. Once full tidal pressure reached the doors, the mechanism might jam, the operator might not be able to leave. Yara said nothing for several moments, then asked whether another person could do it. Abini answered, no. That was not entirely true. Mako could have done it, he had helped repair the same gate years earlier, he knew the release sequence and the damaged locking teeth, but Mako rode with Thaddeus. Abini no longer included him among the living she intended to protect. The escape was set for 3 nights later. Preparation began immediately. Yara divided the 63 adults into 6 groups, they would leave their work locations separately, then gather in abandoned cultivation trenches west of Mororo Reach. No one would carry more than necessary, no lamps, no metal tools that could strike against stone, no written routes. Abini spent the following days preparing the King's Spine. She cleared one drainage channel to keep the embankment stable during the crossing, she blocked another with packed reed so pressure would build behind it, she loosened the braces on the outer gate but left them strong enough to hold until the release. This operation differed from the earlier failures, she was not preparing uncertainty, she was preparing a timed destruction. If she opened the gates too early, the 63 would be trapped in the marsh, if she opened them too late, Thaddeus would reach the far side. There would be no second attempt. Cornelius discovered signs of movement before the appointed night. Food was missing from 2 storage rooms, a supply boat had lost a coil of rope, several workers on a neighboring estate had exchanged duties without permission. None of those details proved escape, together they established preparation. Cornelius ordered a count across Mororo Reach and sent warnings to surrounding plantations. He assembled every remaining hunter willing to ride the coastal roads, guards, armed overseers, replacements from inland estates. These men had heard about the 31 disappearances, but they were more afraid of losing payment than of the marsh. Cornelius promised double rewards. Fear was purchased with money. The black jackal would lead the column. Abini learned of the mobilization while repairing the outer gate, two guards discussing it behind her. They said Thaddeus had received information that a large group would move west. They did not know the exact road. Not yet. Abini could not warn Yara without abandoning the sluice house and exposing the plan. She continued working while the guards named the patrol's gathering point. By nightfall, the 63 had already begun moving. The first group reached the king's spine shortly before the tide changed. Yara sent them across in a single line, each person keeping one hand on the shoulder ahead. The road held. The second group followed, then the third. Abini stood inside the outer sluice house with both hands resting near the release levers. She could hear water pressing against the doors, and she could also hear distant hooves, the sound arriving earlier than expected. Lanterns appeared beyond the cane fields. Thaddeus had found the route. Yara accelerated the crossing, but the king's spine could not carry more than a narrow line without breaking. The fourth group reached the far side, the fifth entered the central stretch, the sixth remained near Abini's end of the embankment. Behind them, the hunting column emerged from the darkness. Thaddeus rode near the front, the black jackal was ahead of him. Abini placed one hand on the first lever. The masked tracker slowed his horse, looking past the escaping adults and directly toward the sluice house. Then he raised his left hand, two fingers extended, his thumb pressed against his palm. It was not a hunter's command, it was the signal Mako had used before their failed escape 3 years earlier. Wait, I am still with you. Abini did not move. The signal held her in place longer than fear ever had. Two fingers extended, thumb against the palm. Wait, I am still with you. Mako had used it years earlier when armed supervisors approached the canal works. It was never meant for strangers. It was not a gesture a hunter could have learned by observation. The man beneath the mask was her husband. That truth did not absolve him. Not yet. Behind him, Thaddeus Krall ordered the column forward. Mako did not obey. He turned his horse across the embankment, forcing the next two riders to slow. One struck his shoulder against Mako's saddle and cursed, another attempted to pass along the edge of the king's spine, but Mako drove him back toward the center. The movement appeared clumsy, it was deliberate. The sixth group of freedom seekers stepped onto the embankment. Yara stood near the far end, pulling people off the narrow road and into the mangrove path. She could see the riders closing, she could not see Abini inside the sluice house. She raised one arm faster. There was no room to run, the 63 had to cross in line. One misplaced step could break the outer edge before the tide arrived. Panic would kill them more efficiently than the hunters. Abini kept her hand above the first release lever. Mako looked toward her again, then faced Thaddeus. Thaddeus rode up beside him and pointed toward the escaping group. Mako indicated the left edge of the embankment, claiming the ground there was unstable. It was true, but not the full truth, the right side would fail first once Abini opened the gates. Thaddeus ordered 3 riders to dismount and continue on foot. Mako moved his horse into their path. One of the men shoved him. Mako did not resist openly, allowing his horse to turn sideways and blocking the road for several more seconds. Those seconds moved 8 more people toward the far bank. Abini watched the delay with growing certainty. Mako was not confused, he was protecting them. The realization came without relief, it brought evidence against everything she had believed. The false trail at the rice canal, the erased water cut after the retaining wall collapsed, the carved warning beneath the gate lever. The patrol led west while Yara's group moved east. Each act had appeared separate because Abini had interpreted Mako through the lie Cornelius had given her. Now the pattern changed. Mako had not been hunting beside Thaddeus, he had been sabotaging him from within reach of his hand. The black jackal was not a collaborator elevated by the plantation, he was a captive assigned a different form of labor. That distinction had been concealed because Cornelius understood the damage truth could cause. If Abini knew Mako was still resisting, she might trust him. If she believed he had betrayed her, the plantation could turn separation into hostility. Slavery did not control only movement, it controlled information. It manufactured suspicion between people whose cooperation threatened it. Thaddeus drew his pistol, pressing the barrel against Mako's side. Move. Mako remained in place. The mask hid most of his face, but not his decision. He pulled the leather covering away. Abini saw him clearly for the first time in 3 years, his face thinner, a scar crossing his cheek beneath the old wound near his ear, his hair graying at the temples. He looked toward the sluice house. No explanation could pass across that distance, none was needed. Thaddeus struck him with the pistol and forced his horse aside. The riders began moving again. Mako recovered and drove his mount into the first man attempting to pass. Both horses turned sharply, the narrow road filling with noise and confusion. The action exposed him. There was no longer any possibility that Thaddeus would mistake the obstruction for incompetence. Mako had chosen a side in public. 2 guards pulled him from the saddle, he hit the embankment hard and rolled toward the edge. One man seized his coat, another raised a weapon. Thaddeus stopped them, wanting Mako alive long enough to understand the betrayal. That delay saved him for the moment, it also gave Abini the first clear proof of why he had worn the mask. A man who joined the hunters willingly would not destroy his position when escape remained possible. Mako could have ridden away from the flood zone, he had known enough to avoid every damaged road. Instead, he stayed in front of Thaddeus and revealed himself when the 63 needed time. The final group reached the middle of the king's spine. Abini counted them, 9 remained on the near side, then 7, then 5. The water struck the outer sluice doors with greater force, the tide had turned. Abini had minutes at most. Mako twisted free from one guard and knocked the second into the road. He seized the reins of a loose horse and pulled it across the embankment. The riders behind him stopped again, Thaddeus fired, the shot struck the wooden rail beside Mako. The horse reared and nearly forced 2 men into the basin. Abini saw Mako reach beneath his coat, removing a short knife, not raising it toward Thaddeus, but cutting the strap securing one of the hunter's supply packs and throwing it into the horse's path. Metal tools scattered across the road, one animal stepped back, another turned, confusion spread through the column. Mako was using every small obstruction available, a method Abini recognized because it was the same as hers: do not defeat the entire system at once, make it lose time. The last 5 freedom seekers entered the embankment. Yara reached them from the far side and guided them through the final narrow section. Abini pulled the first lever halfway, the inner channel opened, water beginning to enter the packed reeds behind the king's spine, not enough to break it, not yet. Mako heard the change, he looked toward the sluice house and understood Abini had started the sequence. Thaddeus understood as well, he ordered 4 riders to abandon their horses and take the gatehouse. They left the embankment and moved through the shallow margin toward Abini, the water still below their knees. Abini lowered the first lever into place and moved to the second. She could release the tide now. The final 3 people were still on the road. If she waited, the guards might reach her; if she opened the gates, the remaining group could be caught in the first surge. Mako saw the men approaching the sluice house. He broke away from Thaddeus and ran toward them. One guard turned, Mako struck him with the wooden handle of the knife, the second seized Mako from behind, and they fell into the shallow water. The other 2 continued toward Abini. Mako had not come to escape, he had come to hold the distance between her and them. Yara pulled the final person from the embankment. All 63 had reached the far side. Abini gripped the second lever. For one brief moment, she could still change the plan, close the inner channel, try to draw Mako toward the gatehouse, delay the flood and give him a chance to cross. But Thaddeus had already regained his horse, the hunters were advancing. If the gates remained closed, the 63 would be trapped in the mangroves before they reached the vessel. Abini looked at Mako. He had forced himself upright, one guard held his left arm, another stood behind him. Thaddeus approached from the embankment. Mako met Abini's eyes, he shook his head once, "Do not wait." Abini did not know whether he had helped 6 people or 60, she did not know how many hunts he had delayed, how many routes he had changed, or how many accusations he had endured without being able to defend himself. She knew only what the next decision required, 1 life against 63. The plantation had created that calculation, it had separated them, lied to them, forced Mako to wear the mask of an enemy, and waited until the final seconds to reveal the truth. Now it demanded that Abini choose whom the sea would take. Mako nodded. Abini pulled the second lever. The outer locking teeth released, the wood groaned under pressure. She moved to the main control and placed both hands around it. On the embankment, Mako turned toward Thaddeus, stepping into the center of the road. Abini pulled. The main gates opened. The sea entered Mororo Reach. The first surge struck the king's spine from the basin side, the second came from the outer channel. The embankment held for several seconds, then packed earth began to separate along the weakened edge. Mako remained in the center of the road, Thaddeus tried to force his horse past him, Mako seized the bridle and pulled the animal sideways, blocking the narrow crossing. The riders behind them compressed into a single line with nowhere to turn. The mistake was immediate, a mounted patrol depended on movement, once trapped on the embankment, the horses became obstacles to one another. Men attempted to dismount, others tried to reverse, the road gave them neither space nor time. Water crossed the surface, reaching their boots first, then the horses' legs. Thaddeus struck Mako with the pistol, but Mako did not release the bridle, he had already accepted what the delay would cost. Across the mangrove channel, Yara ordered the 63 adults toward the waiting vessel. They did not stop to watch, freedom did not permit ceremony. The boat was concealed behind a wall of roots and low branches, 2 sailors held it against the current while the first group climbed aboard. The vessel sat dangerously low as more people entered, but no one was left behind. Yara counted each person again, 60, then 61, 62, 63. Behind them, the king's spine broke. The central section collapsed beneath the front riders, water entered the opening and widened it. Horses lost their footing, men reached for the remaining rail, but the timber tore free under their weight. The scene required no exaggeration, a road built to support the machinery of captivity was destroyed by the same water enslaved laborers had spent generations controlling. The system had trusted the embankment because it had never considered the loyalty of the woman maintaining it. Mako disappeared from Abini's view when the first section fell. Thaddeus remained visible for a few seconds longer, trying to reach higher ground by climbing across a damaged support beam, the current turned the timber beneath him, then he was gone. Inside the sluice house, the main lever kicked backward. Abini held it with both arms. If the mechanism slipped before the outer gates locked into position, the doors could close again and reduce the flood before the road was fully severed. The damaged teeth shook against the iron frame, Abini pressed her shoulder into the lever. A wooden brace cracked above her, water entered beneath the door, the gatehouse began to tilt toward the canal. She kept the release open until the final section of the king's spine disappeared. Only then did she let go. The lever struck the wall, Abini fell against the maintenance table. One side of the building had shifted, trapping the exit door beneath its frame. She forced the shutter open and climbed through the narrow window. The water outside reached her waist, she moved toward the higher maintenance bank while broken boards, lanterns, and pieces of saddle drifted past her. No one followed. By sunrise, the vessel carrying the 63 had reached open water. The plantation boats could not pursue it, the main channel was blocked by debris, and the remaining patrol horses could not cross the flooded roads. Yara looked back once, Mororo Reach was hidden behind the mangroves. Abini was not on the vessel, Mako was not among the survivors. Their work had opened the route, it had not delivered them through it. At the plantation, Cornelius Rusk refused to describe what had happened as an escape, he called it sabotage. That word allowed him to avoid the central fact: 63 adults had rejected his claim over their bodies and had crossed beyond his control. Cornelius sent workers to recover equipment and search the flooded ground. They found sections of bridle, 2 rifles, damaged lantern frames, and several saddles caught among the roots. Thad Discrawl's body was never formally identified, neither was Mako's. Near the broken gate, a worker found the black jackal's leather mask lodged beneath a length of timber. Cornelius took it as proof. He announced that the masked tracker had betrayed the estate, manipulated the hunters, and opened the sluices to assist the escape. The accusation solved several problems for him. Mako was absent, he had worked closely with the patrols, he knew the routes, and he could no longer defend himself. Cornelius placed the entire conspiracy on a man he had already forced to live behind a false identity. The official account was convenient. It was also incomplete. Abini stood among the drainage workers while Cornelius presented his conclusion. Her clothes were still marked by salt and mud from the flood. No one questioned why she had survived near the gatehouse. She explained that the structure had failed and she had escaped through the window. The damage supported her claim. Cornelius wanted a single culprit, Mako provided one. Abini allowed him to take it. Correcting the record would have exposed the surviving routes, Yara's network and every worker who had helped prepare the crossing. Truth offered no protection under a system designed to punish it, silence did. The coastal plantation circulated warnings describing the black jackal as a traitor who had turned against the men who trusted him. That was how the owners recorded Mako, not as a captive, not as a saboteur working under threat, not as the man who stood across a collapsing road to protect 63 people. They recorded only the version that preserved their authority. Several days after the flood, Abini returned to the damaged sluice house. The lower wall had split, mud covered the floor, the maintenance table had been pushed into the gate housing. She searched without knowing precisely what she expected to find. Beneath a loose floorboard, her hand touched wood. She pulled out a short knife, Mako's. The blade was stained and dull, the handle worn smooth by years of use. Along one side were small carved marks. Abini counted them, 63. Her first conclusion was brutal. She believed Mako had recorded the people he helped capture. The number appeared too exact to be accidental. She wrapped the knife in cloth and carried it away from the work crews. Yara returned to the district weeks later. She had left the escape vessel before it moved farther along the coast. Her role had not ended with one crossing. Other adults remained on the plantations, and the collapse of the patrol network had created a temporary opportunity. Abini met her beside an abandoned storage trench. She showed Yara the knife. Yara examined the marks, then rejected Abini's interpretation. Mako had used the same marking system on route posts and hidden tools. Yara had seen it before. One mark for each successful diversion, not each capture, each escape. During the 3 years he rode behind the mask, Mako had redirected patrols, concealed tracks, delayed searches, and led hunters away from boats. Yara's network had counted the people saved by those failures. The number was 63. Before the final night, Mako had already helped 63 adults escape. Abini opened the sea for another 63. The symmetry was not planned, it was evidence of 2 connected campaigns conducted without trust, recognition, or direct coordination. Mako had resisted inside the hunting party, Abini had resisted inside the drainage system. Cornelius had kept them apart, not only with force, but with misinformation. He had made Abini believe Mako was dead, then allowed her to see him wearing the mask of an enemy. That lie nearly succeeded, it turned grief into suspicion, made protection appear to be betrayal, and ensured that 2 people working toward the same goal could not recognize one another until the final minutes. That was not a side effect of slavery, it was one of its methods. The system isolated people, controlled what they knew, and then used the resulting distrust as another form of confinement. After the destruction of the king's spine, the slave-catching network around Mororo Reach never recovered. The surviving hunters demanded higher fees, some refused to cross coastal roads during high tide. Plantation owners shortened patrols and relied more heavily on guards near the fields, that reduced the reach of their searches beyond estate boundaries. The fear remained practical. 31 hunters had already died or disappeared before the final flood. Thaddeus was gone, the most experienced routes had been destroyed. Every remaining rider understood that the ground itself could be manipulated against him. Abini returned to work. Cornelius could not replace her knowledge quickly. The plantation still required functioning canals even after the escape. Sugar remained dependent on the same woman the owner had failed to identify as his principal opponent. She repaired smaller gates, rebuilt sections of the drainage bank, and continued pretending not to hear conversations spoken behind her. On moonless nights, she altered selected channels, not every change causing destruction, most creating delay. A patrol arrived late, a boat found an unexpected opening, a road remained dry for people on foot and softened before mounted riders reached it. More adults disappeared from the surrounding estates. No monument was built for Abini, no official account connected her to the 31 disappearances or the escape of the 63. Mako's name survived only in accusations written by men who had controlled the record. But the coast retained the result. The hunters learned to test every road, the plantation owners learned that the sluice keys could not guarantee obedience, and the enslaved learned that Mororo Reach contained one passage the owners could never fully close. They had believed power belonged to rifles, horses, property claims, and written orders. For 9 nights in 1822, power belonged to a woman beside a wooden gate. She did not defeat the system without loss, she opened the sea knowing the man she loved would remain on the other side. That decision saved 63 lives and ended his. It was not a clean victory. Systems built on human captivity did not allow clean choices. They forced the oppressed to calculate survival against sacrifice, then judged them for the consequences. The final question is not whether Abini remained innocent, it is why innocence was demanded from her while men like Cornelius and Thaddeus were protected by law. Was Abini right to open the gates when she knew Mako could not escape? Should Mako be remembered as a hero? Or did the years he spent riding beside the hunters make his role more complicated? Share your theory in the comments and tell us your city, your country, and the time you are listening. Then subscribe, because the darkest chapters of history are often the ones preserved not by official records, but by people who refuse to let silence have the final word.